80,000 toxic chemicals have been released into our environment since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and very few have been tested for their long-term impact on human health. And let me tell you, the results are not pretty for those that have been tested. How can we not be affected by this massive amount of poison? According to the nonprofit organization, the Environmental Working Group, the average newborn baby has 287 known toxins in his or her umbilical cord blood. If a newborn is exposed to that many toxins before they take their first breath, how many have you been exposed to throughout your life? The simple truth is that we're living in a sea of toxins and that it's destroying our bodies and our brains.
So chemicals are all around us. There's some good, some bad, some natural, and some man-made. And when I talk about living in the chemical age, the title of my book, I'm really talking about the fact that now, more than at any other time in our history, we are inundated with toxic man-made chemicals. These are chemicals that just didn't exist 100 years ago, and we're finding them in our food, our water, our personal care products, our cleaning products, even some of the medicines that we're taking. And so, since some of these chemicals, well, most of them actually, you can't see them, you can't smell them, most people don't even know that they exist. And let alone what kind of impact they might be having on the body. Over the past century, we've had thousands of chemicals enter our environment. In 1976, this is a pivotal year, the Environmental Protection Agency enacted a special statute called the Toxic Substances Control Act. And the intention was to create some awareness for the public about what kind of chemicals existed. At that time, there were 62,000 chemicals on the market. And because they had been on the market for a while, they grandfathered them in and deemed them safe. Today, we have approximately 85,000 chemicals on the market, and only a few hundred of those have ever been tested for safety. Our bodies, I like to think of it as we have a silo. I grew up in the Midwest, so maybe that's why it resonates with me. But if we're inundated with a lot of toxic chemicals and they're being brought into the body in multiple ways, either through our skin or the food that we eat, the water that we drink, the air that we breathe, and they're not able to be utilized by the body. They're synthetic. Our body doesn't really know how to utilize them in any way. They build up in layers in that silo. And if we can't purge them out of our body quick enough, those layers build up. And if they get to the top of that silo, that's when we start noticing the symptoms of these toxic chemicals. Things like skin rashes or unexplained weight gain or different autoimmune disorders, headaches, things like that. That's our body's way of telling us that there's something wrong and that we need to take a look at our toxic load.
In this episode of Broken Brain 2, we're going to talk about toxins, what are the biggest sources of toxins, and how can we minimize our exposure to these insults. We will talk about mold and water. We'll talk about pesticides and household products and cosmetics and much, much more. We'll also talk about a source of toxicity that quickly is becoming a hot topic. We're going to talk about EMFs, or electromagnetic frequencies. The role of toxins and the importance of detoxification in health and disease is a critical part of maintaining your best brain health. Unfortunately, you probably aren't going to learn much about them from your doctor. Most doctors were simply never taught about nutrition, about toxins, and certainly not about detoxification in medical school.
So let's talk about toxicity. What is it and what is detoxification? Now, when you hear the word detox, you might be thinking drug detox or alcohol detox or wheatgrass enemas. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm referring to the science of how your bodies get rid of waste. Now, if waste builds up, we get sick. And the key to good health is to figure out how to enhance your body's capacity to detoxify and to get rid of waste while minimizing your exposures. So cut the exposures and increase the excretion and detoxification. This is so important because many diseases in our society are actually related to toxicity. Disorders such as Parkinson's disease, which is really clearly linked to environmental toxins, Alzheimer's, ADD, depression, insomnia, can all stem from toxic overload. When we have problems with detoxification or toxic overload, it's one of the root causes of chronic disease. And it can be a clue that one of the core systems in your body that has to work for you to be healthy is not working. If you feel lousy, it's likely you're toxic. I call this FLC syndrome. That's when you feel like crap. Now, it's important to understand why we're toxic and how we can actually detoxify. To understand toxicity, you must understand the concept of total load. Now, total load is the total amount of stressors on your system at any one time. It's like what happens when a glass overfills with water. It takes a certain amount of water to fill the glass, and then after a certain point, you put more in it, it just overflows. And that's exactly what happens in our body. We can handle toxins for a while, and then, boom, our bodies collapse. And that's what happened to me.
As I mentioned, last year I discovered that I had a huge mold problem in my house. Not only did I have to completely gut my house to get rid of this stuff, but it was actually making me very sick. And the entire process of dealing with the toxic mold in my house really got me thinking about air toxicity and the need for precautions that I needed to take to protect myself and my family from various pollutants in the air.
Well, about a year before I figured out there was mold in my house, I developed a cough, and it was productive. And I thought I developed a cold, but it didn't go away. And like the average doctor, I pretty much ignored it and just tolerated it and thought it would just resolve on its own. Didn't really see a doctor, of course, because I'm a doctor and doctors don't need to see doctors. But in fact, finally I did, and I had an x-ray and it showed thickening of my lungs and really kind of nasty stuff. A few months later, I went to have an evaluation as a prevention strategy at the Human Longevity Institute, which is Craig Venter's institute, the guy who decoded the human genome. And I had my whole genome sequenced. I had brain scans, body scans, pretty much every scan you can imagine. And on the brain scan, parts of my brain were affected. And I saw, as part of an educational seminar, a guy who was an expert in mold. And he looked at my brain scan and he says, "You have mold." And I said, "Wow, I didn't realize it." And so I went and had my house evaluated. It turned out it was full of mold. I realized my cough then was from the mold.
So the fascinating thing about mold exposure is that it can affect almost every organ system in the body, but there's some things that I really get suspicious when a patient comes in and tells me about. So if somebody says, "Oh, I'm having headaches or brain fog, or I'm just feeling really exhausted," or there's been an uptick in the amount of pain that they have in their body, either in their muscles or in their joints, they've developed a skin rash, like even newly diagnosed psoriasis or eczema. Those are things that the most of the time can trigger me to start thinking about mold. And then some people actually have a big impact on their gastrointestinal system. So they might feel nauseated a lot more easier, have bloating or gas, or even more serious symptoms like inflammatory bowel disease that can come with mold exposure.
What you find out from toxic mold is that it comes in and it poisons its ancient enemy. What does mold hate? Bacteria. That's where penicillin comes from. It's a mold toxin, just like the toxins that can poison us today. Our bodies are powered by ancient bacteria called mitochondria. So some species of mold make really nasty chemicals that slow down your body's ability to make energy in cells, which leads to inflammation in the brain and elsewhere. So when you're in a house that has toxic mold, or even if you've been exposed at work, you come home and you lay down and you go to sleep and you wake up and you feel hungover. And you didn't really get much sleep that night, and then you start getting sinus infections, you get frequent bruising, nosebleeds, huge amounts of emotional symptoms where you yell at people you love. But the symptoms are so all over the place. Neurological, buzzing in your legs, or your arm hurts, or you get sore joints, all just nothing explainable, rashes. So you go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, someone with this many symptoms, clearly they're not sick, they're crazy. And they try to give you Prozac because we are not taught in medical school that one thing in the environment at a parts per billion concentration can completely wreck your biology. And the way it does that is by hitting you at the power plants. So the energy that causes you to make healthy skin so you don't have wrinkles, the stuff that gives you enough neurotransmitters, it's all just off kilter.
About 5 years ago, I started experiencing extreme fatigue. I had moved into a new apartment late in 2012. And throughout that winter and then into the spring of 2013, I just found myself really exhausted. And, kind of didn't really think too much of it, but did find a new doctor, conventional medicine doctor, here in New York City, and did complete workups and everything checked out great. Later that year, in August of 2013, my neighbor's pipes broke. Their fire sprinkler system burst and flooded their apartment, parts of my apartment, and the unit below us. And ultimately, about a month later, we started having mold growing. And I had mold growing up in my kitchen, living room areas, and it was never remediated properly. And that's when my health really declined. I was getting severe back pain. My kidney function just didn't seem right. My urine would be super cloudy. Fatigue was even worse. Now my digestive health really went to complete, just horrible. I mean, it was to the point where I would have to be concerned about being near a bathroom. But mental clarity, fog, confusion, vision issues, vein pain, as I know it probably sounds crazy, but felt like my veins were hurting. I had pins and needles on my skin, just everything kind of started to unfold. In October of 2014, I went to my first functional medicine doctor, Dr. Pamela Yee. At the time, she was in New York City, and now she's in New York, Westchester area. And I'll never forget that day. It was the... It was the first day that a medical professional really acknowledged what I was going through. And not only told me that they believed what I was saying, because up until this point, doctors would say, no one could have that many symptoms, or that doesn't make sense, or we don't know why that's happening. And she believed me. But not only did she believe me, she told me that there was hope and that she thought she could help me. And she did.
A report from the American Lung Association, with the help of the Environmental Protection Agency, identified air toxicity as one of the top 5 most urgent environmental risks to public health. According to the EPA in 1985, indoor air quality can be up to 500 times more polluted than outdoor air. Your home is like a Ziploc bag containing airborne pollutants that you can't escape. When you breathe polluted air, you introduce toxins into every cell of your body. The air circulates throughout your entire body, impacting internal organs, including the heart, the lungs, kidneys, and liver.
So I bought this wonderful new office here in Austin, Texas. Beautiful, looks great, and I had no idea that there was any mold in there. And it turns out, particularly in southern states like Austin, you're at risk for these older buildings of building up condensation in the AC system because it's so humid out here. And it turns out way before we bought it, there was a lot of condensation from the humidity in the AC system that became the incubation for black Stachybotrys mold. And within 6 months of buying this office, the AC duct was aimed right at my face. And within 6 months of moving into this wonderful office, I started getting very symptomatic with chronic fatigue and massive joint inflammation throughout my body. And I had no idea what that was about and never put 2 and 2 together.
The way that I check for mycotoxins is a urine-based test. So there are 2 companies now, and there's a third one on the way, that can, from a urine sample, detect several different mycotoxins. We still need a lot more of the toxins to be detected, but usually if there's something going on, at least one of those will be positive because the molds usually grow in families of multiple types. The number one thing to address with patients is to make sure that they are not continuing to be exposed. So sometimes we can get people to start to feel better by helping them to detoxify, support their livers, support their mitochondria in the environment. But the best thing is to figure out how to not be in that environment, at least until it can be remediated. So then we really need to help to open up the spigots to really help the person to be able to get the toxins out. So supplements are super helpful. So I really like liposomal glutathione, and then some of the binders like charcoal, clay, modified citrus pectin, to help to draw the toxins out, plus a lot of liver support, gallbladder support. And then one of the things that happens with the mycotoxins is that the mitochondria get damaged. So we really have to feed the mitochondria. So things like repairing cell membranes with phosphatidylcholine, and then giving things that help the mitochondria work better, like CoQ10 and D-ribose and carnitine, so that the body has the fuel and energy to do the repair and to detoxify.
So for both my office and my house, the first thing that I learned about is how do you control relative humidity? It turns out not even knowing better. In the hot summers of Austin, Texas, we were doing like 70% relative humidity in our homes, which most people do. Because remember, AC systems are designed for one environment. And what works in Seattle doesn't necessarily work in Houston or Tampa or Sedona. They're all of different things. And it turns out our AC system couldn't keep up with the relative humidity. So the first thing we did in our home is we actually put in 2 separate systems to control the relative humidity of the home. The Munter system is the main one, which I actually put. A more affordable alternative is there's a product called Ultra Air that we also put in our house. And there's some systems, by the way, and if you actually engineer your house properly, your AC system is focused more on dehumidifying. So if it's engineered correctly, you may need nothing. You may just simply make sure that your house is engineered for the most humid day in your neighborhood, that your system can kind of control the air. But if it can't, a wonderful supplement to your AC system is this Insta Air system that goes side by side. Also pulls in some outside air for positive pressurization, but it really assists your AC system in keeping to that 55%. And by the way, the cool thing about that is when you keep drier air in your house, it's also much less work on your AC system. And what you're going to find out is that your utility bills will possibly go down as well. And another thing is, a lot of people don't realize that, think about it, it's kind of silly that we have plumbing underneath our sink, which is one of the most common places where mold comes, and under our laundry sink and our bathroom sinks. And yet, ironically, most people have wood cabinets, which is mold food in the right conditions. So what a lot of people are doing now, the cheapest, most expensive thing is put a piece of plastic or put a metal cabinet and check underneath there. So if water does drip, you don't immediately create mold conditions underneath there. And the second thing to do is there's actually now water alarms that if it senses a drip underneath your sink, it'll go off of just like a smoke detector, and they're relatively inexpensive. But I promise you, if you can catch it early, it's much, much cheaper than trying to remediate and knock out your kitchen cabinets and finding through what's in your drywall. So there really are low-hanging, inexpensive ways to kind of defend against the most obvious things, which is going to be, if it's not coming from your roof, it's probably coming from your plumbing as far as a water source.
And what's frightening to me is that there is a clear and present link from mold toxins in our environment and our food and cancer, cardiovascular disease, and especially Alzheimer's disease. So we have, according to my calculations, at least 100 million structures in the US that are affected by toxic mold right now. And people think there's nothing they can do because they can't afford to move. One of the things that I've done to help solve this problem, I started a company called Homebiotic. And it's a natural probiotic that you spray around your house. You can't tell it's there. And it eats toxic mold as its fuel source. In soil, we have healthy bacteria that eat toxic mold, and then they come to an equilibrium. In your home, you have no bacteria. So when a few mold spores and a little bit of moisture comes in, it can grow in the drywall, and suddenly you wake up and you just feel like a zombie. So we've got to fix the way we make our houses. We've got to raise awareness that if you can see or smell mold, it is a clear and present risk to your health and even your survival for some people, certainly to your longevity and to your brain. And that there's things you can do, whether it's an air filter, whether it's fixing ventilation, or spraying Homebiotic around. You got to get on top of that stuff because toxic mold can really take away the quality of your life if it doesn't take away your life itself. We oftentimes think about how do we support our bodies? How do we get more energy? How do we do these things? oftentimes the simplest thing is to stop doing what makes you weak. So it's not about doing more, it's actually about stop the bad stuff before you do the good stuff. In the case of toxic mold, you get away from it. You either remove yourself from it or you remove it from your environment, and then you go through and you clean out the poisons that it leaves behind in your body.
Air purifiers really are a great choice to help improve your indoor air quality. Of course, the first thing you want to do is do prevention and avoid the things that are contributing to making your air quality harmful. But we can't control everything, and we certainly can't control the ultrafine particles that are getting into our house. We can't control dust. We can't control allergens that might be coming in, smoke from the outside. So having an air purifier in your home can be a great way to improve the quality of air in your home. The one thing about air purifiers is that most air purifiers that you buy at a store like Walmart or Costco or Target or Home Depot, they're really only removing half of the contaminants from the air because they only have particulate filters and they don't have an activated carbon filter large enough to remove the volatile organic chemicals that are in the air. So if you're looking for an air purifier for your home, I really do suggest that you purchase one that's like a professional quality that has both a high-end HEPA filter and a large activated carbon filter with at least a ½ inch thick amount of carbon in it. All credible air purifiers have been tested by a laboratory called Intertek, which is a worldwide testing organization that sets standards for testing air purifiers, and that standard is called CADR, or Clean Air Delivery Rate. And the CADR is a scale so that a consumer can compare how one air purifier performs to another air purifier. It's a numeric scale. So most of the air purifiers that you'll see again at the mass market retailers like Walmart and Target and Costco and Home Depot, they'll have a CADR range from 30. I think the most you generally see is up to 150, sometimes 200. In my opinion, you should look for an air purifier with a CADR over 300, and that will ensure that it really has the power and performance to clean the air in a large bedroom or a living room or a common area.
I think it's important, one, that you understand not everybody is affected by mold in the same ways. I was highly susceptible to becoming sick from mold, and genetically that's been shown. There are people who are less susceptible, so you can have two people living in a house with mold, one's sick, one's not, and they fight because the one who's not thinks the other person's crazy, but in fact they're not. They are actually sick, and they get immune activation. And my advice is to, if you suspect mold, to find someone who can identify and examine your house for mold, who's not the remediator. In other words, you don't want the guy who's going to fix the house, the one telling you whether there's mold in it, because there's a conflict of interest there. You want someone who's independent, who can really do an evaluation. That's the first step. And then it might be a simple problem. It might be a water leak in one area, it can be simply fixed, or it might be that the whole house is contaminated. And then you need to find a mold remediator, which then means they have to come in and clean the house. So we literally had to clean everything. We had to do it with special materials, borax and other cleaning agents that can actually get rid of the mold.
Many of us think so much about, do we eat clean food? What diet are we on? But many of us take the water we drink, and even more the air we breathe, for granted. And yet those are the real fundamental building blocks of every chemical reaction that takes place in our body. And just like a car, you want to put clean fuel in your car or it's not going to run properly. And if you continue to abuse your car, it's going to break down. And the same thing takes place with our body. So clean water, clean air are essential for a healthy life.
We are all people. We all need this planet. No water, no air, game over. And how do we clear that table and just get busy dealing with human life and our environment and what we've done to it and how we can, moving forward, protect it and clean our water and deal with regulations to have a healthy environment? We are the environment. The environment is us. We are so connected. So I can't think of a state in America with multiple towns within that state that haven't reached out to me with groundwater issues, whether it's they can't balance their trihalomethanes or adding ammonia, which is, sequestering chlorination, which is in part why we're seeing Legionnaire outbreaks, or we're seeing brain-eating amoebas, or we're creating corrosive, acidic water, and we're deteriorating all of our lead pipes further, and we're seeing all these lead contaminations. Dealing with perfluoroalkyl acids, which is the largest emerging contaminant in the United States nationwide today. From what I'm known for, it's weird being known for a toxic hazardous chemical, hexavalent chromium, to huge outbreaks of trichloroethylene pollution. I mean, the list could go on and on. It's pretty daunting, but it's real and it's happening. So whether it's well water, whether it's us turning on the tap, whether fracking's running wells dry or polluting wells, or looking at climate change and all of the issues that are happening, water, the single one necessary element that sustains all life, is in jeopardy and polluted everywhere. And it's like beating my head against the wall to get any national priority to this issue. Flint, Michigan, everyone's familiar with. We're working on 200 other Flints throughout the United States. Most people don't know, if you go and walk down the Senate hall and you happen to stop in the restroom, there's signs. Don't drink the water, contaminated with lead. So lead in 200 other cities besides Flint. TCE outbreaks throughout the United States. One of the worst we've seen is at Camp Lejeune, where our own agencies have estimated about 20,000 returning soldiers and their families could come down with cancer, but let's not do anything about that. Hexavalent chromium problems, they're not just in Hinckley. I'm working on them in Texas. I'm working on in the parts of the Northeast. Oh my gosh, I've had hexavalent chromiums come to me in Australia, in parts of Africa, in France, in Greece, one of the worst I've ever seen, in a little town called Onafita. So that's an international issue with just one chemical. Now Europe has banned it. America hasn't done that yet. We still can't even get them to set an MCL for hexavalent chromium in drinking water since I began my work in 1991, so over 20 plus years. The federal agencies still won't do it, yet there's so much science that's already in that concludes it does cause cancer by ingestion. So, I'm working in Illinois on many groundwater issues: atrazine, hexavalent chromium, TCE, too much chloramines, bad trihalomethanes, lead contamination. We've got 18 million miles of lead pipeline. Oh gosh, forbid, let's not deal with that. So we have lead contamination. So every single state, like I even told you with just PFOA, is now Florida, New Hampshire, Vermont, Alabama, Virginia, West Virginia, Michigan, Minnesota, California, Colorado, Ohio, every state. There wouldn't be one state that hasn't reported multiple groundwater issues.
The CDC and the Health Department in Washington, D.C. for many years covered up the fact that they have in Washington, they have virtually the exact same problem that they have in Flint, with children in poor neighborhoods getting high levels of contamination, of lead contamination, and having high lead levels, blood lead concentrations, which is very, very damaging. It affects behavior, it affects IQ. It really, it's an anchor on that child for the rest of his life. We passed the Clean Water Act in the early 1970s, and it immediately became effective. I remember, I remember before Earth Day 1970, the Cuyahoga River was burning with flames that were 8 stories high. I grew up, I couldn't swim in the Hudson, the Charles, or the Potomac rivers when I was growing up, and I grew up in those communities. I remember when, the Santa Barbara oil spill, which closed all the beaches in Southern California in 1969, the same year Lake Erie was declared dead. And those insults and others On Earth Day 1970, drove 20 million Americans out onto the street. The largest public demonstration in United States history at that time. And they were demanding that our political leaders come in and protect the environment and restore the ancient environmental rights that, that had been taken from our citizens over the previous 80 years. The political system responded. Nixon was president. Both Republicans and Democrats got together. Nixon created EPA. He was kicking and screaming. He signed the Clean Water Act, signed the Clean Air Act. We passed 28 major environmental statutes over the next 11 years that are designed to protect the commons, the air, the water, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands. But ever since then, industry has mobilized to mitigate the costs of those laws, to try to subvert those laws, to erode them, to attack them, and to attack their applicability.
In 2015, one of the landmark studies came out by Lanphier, and they showed that if you have an increase in your blood levels of lead from 10 parts per billion to 100 parts per billion, that will decrease the IQ of 7 points. Now, that may not be a lot for one child. You may not notice a difference, but on a population level, that's an enormous difference. And that is something that we need to pay attention to, because just that small amount of lead in the body makes that much of a difference. What does that mean for every other kind of metal or toxin out there? We have the data on lead, so we can see that there's this change in IQ. What is that doing to the population when you mix in mercury, when you mix in arsenic, when you mix in all these other chemicals? How is that affecting us? We just don't know. And one of the things that is really frustrating to me as a pediatrician, if you look at the TSCA, the Toxic Substance Care Act, you see that there is no rules in America to stop companies from releasing chemicals into society. There doesn't have to be proven that it's safe. And that is extremely frustrating. Why is that the case? When you look at Europe, you have to prove something is safe before it gets to the market. But in America, we're the guinea pigs. Our children are the guinea pigs. Our families are the guinea pigs, because there's no research to show that something is safe. You just have to put it out there and see if it's okay.
Toxins in our body, they accumulate over time. And so it's very easy to think that the air you're breathing or the water you're drinking isn't having any adverse effect on your body. You think, oh, I feel well, I'm not sick, I have energy, my mood is good. But that's just today. And what's going to happen to you and your children 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when you start developing chronic illnesses? From the air we breathe, it could be asthma or COPD. It could be a heart disease, or it could be dementia, just from breathing air. From drinking water, you could develop any type of cancer. You could be accumulating toxins that affect your skeletal system or even affect your brain. So you really owe it to yourself and your family to make sure that the air you breathe and the water you drink is clean and pure. And I urge everyone to do something about it, to ensure that they live a healthy, happy, long, disease-free life.
This might seem grim, but the truth is there are many things you can do to reduce your toxic exposures and enhance your body's own detoxification system.
Now, toxins can come from many places. So heavy metals like mercury and lead and petrochemical residues, pesticides, fertilizers. They can also come from external environmental sources in addition, such as mold, or internal sources, such as bad gut microbes and the microbiome producing toxins and various dysbiotic bacteria that create imbalances and inflammation and overload in the body. We can also have mental, emotional, and spiritual toxins, such as isolation, loneliness, anger, jealousy, hostility. Loneliness is a killer. We know this from the research. We're going to get into all of that in the next episode, but for this episode, I want to focus on toxins in our environment and toxins in our bodies that form all the physical insults that make us sick. You see, each of us is genetically and biochemically unique. Some of us are good at getting rid of toxins and waste, and others are not. I'm not. That's why I developed chronic fatigue syndrome and why I developed mold toxicity. Some people can be exposed to mold and it doesn't bother them. For me, it did. Others can have mercury in their systems. They get rid of it. I couldn't. I became overloaded with mercury because I couldn't get rid of it because I'm missing a gene that regulates glutathione and also some other genes that have to do with detoxification. This is a critical pathway for getting rid of mercury, and mine was slow. We're going to talk more about this gene later in the genes episode.
When it comes to brain function, when it comes to anxiety, depression, and when it comes to all sorts of fatigue issues, one of the things that's popping up on laboratory analysis constantly in the clinic is mercury toxicity. And when we track it back, it's very clear to see that the mercury is associated with one or two things. One is fish consumption. I see a lot of my CEOs, my well-to-do clients who are eating a tremendous amount of sushi. They're doing high levels of tuna. And the tuna is higher in the mercury, and we'll see the mercury spiked quite high. They are oftentimes on edge. They're having memory loss issues. They're having major fatigue. I also see some of the athletes. Some of my athletes are bringing to the gym with them these little cans of tuna, and that will rise the mercury level a lot. And then the other spectrum is the people who are having fillings. And interestingly enough, my clients will come in complaining of their fatigue or their anxiety or their memory loss, and sometimes I can track it back to teeth cleanings, trips to the dentist, in which they're actually getting a polishing on the top of their tooth, and the polishing was enough to release mercury specifically to the brain and bring their symptoms back. So the awareness, I think, in our society needs to be much higher regarding mercury in the brain.
We do believe, we believe on the philosophy that mouth is not a separate entity from the rest of the body. So whatever material we use in the patient's mouth can have a major contribution in their overall health and systemic health. Or whatever condition is present in the patient's mouth could in long term create overall have an impact on overall health. So we are more of a systemic approach to dentistry rather than focus on the patient's mouth only. So that would be the role of a biological dentist. Silver fillings, amalgam fillings, mercury fillings, this is a terminology that is used interchangeably. Basically, they all mean the same thing. So when someone has a silver filling in their mouth, that metal is an alloy. What does it mean to be an alloy? It's a mixture of different metals. So it is composed of zinc, tin, copper, but the major component of it is actually mercury. Over 50% of a mercury filling or a silver filling or amalgam filling is made out of mercury. So when a patient has silver fillings or mercury fillings in their mouth, as the change of temperature changes in their mouth, they drink something hot tea, hot coffee, hot soup, the mercury vapor gets released. And one of the reasons is because mercury is one metal that is liquid in room temperature. It transfers the temperature quite fast. So again, if you have a silver filling in your mouth, having the major component of it being mercury over 50%, when you drink something hot, that mercury vapor gets released. When you brush your teeth, the friction causes the mercury vapor to get released. When you clench, you chew, especially if you grind your teeth, again, the friction causes the mercury vapor to get released. Now, these are in small increments, but most of us who had silver fillings as a young kid have had them for so many years. So this is going to add up eventually. As this mercury vapor gets released, it's in your mouth. Where does it go? You swallow the mercury vapor, or your nose is right next to mouth. You inhale the mercury vapor. Another means of exposure to mercury actually is when you go to dental office. That's when you get exposed to a high amount of mercury if a dentist starts working on that tooth. What do I mean by that? Most of us who had dentistry done, they know that when a dentist starts working and drilling inside your mouth, there's lots of water everywhere. As we cut into the silver filling or mercury, we are producing massive amount of powder and vapor. So now the patient is very vulnerable because they can accidentally swallow the water, they can inhale the mercury vapor. So that's when the patient gets really massive exposure to mercury in high volume in one session, in one dental appointment. Once you swallow this mercury vapor, once it gets access to your body, what happens next? Our body has our defense mechanism has an amazing ability to scan your body and recognize what is self cell, which is normal, your own cell, versus foreign cell. Once the immune system finds a foreign cell, its job is to go ahead and attack and eliminate that foreign cell, right? That's basically in lame terminology how the defense system works. So once you have mercury in your system, the mercury goes and attaches itself to any type of organ that it chooses. Now it varies. It could be nerves. It could be an organ in endocrine, in the endocrinology. It could be muscle. It could be a heart. It varies. Once it goes and attaches to that cell, now the body recognizes that cell as hapten, which means non-cell. So it's as a damaged cell. It's not a self cell anymore. So what is your immune system going to do? Is going to go ahead and try to eliminate that because it doesn't recognize it as healthy anymore. So now if that amalgam or mercury, if the mercury was attached to, again, the nerve cell, you're going to have a neurological disorder because you're eliminating that neuron, that nerve cells. Or if that was in your reproductive organ, or if it was part of your thyroid, you're going to have thyroid issues. So really, there's going to be a huge, wide range of systemic issues that can arise depending on where the mercury molecule is going to go attach itself. And one of the advice that I usually have for my patients is one of the main ways to really screen your dentist is just by asking a question. It's like, okay, do you have a certain protocol that you follow when you want to remove the mercury filling? And there are three things that should really stand out. And one would be using an oxygen mask on. So when you have an oxygen on, if mercury vapor gets released from your mouth, then you're fully protected. You don't inhale it in because the dentist is wearing a mask. But as a patient, your mouth is open, your airway is open, so you're pretty vulnerable. You want to make sure you don't inhale and swallow this stuff. So oxygen is one of the main things that should stand out. And second would be goggles, eye shield. Third, what we do, we place a dam, special dam inside the patient's mouth. What that dam does, it isolates your tongue, your cheek. The dam literally protects the mercury from passing through. So if you're sectioning the mercury with lots of water, the mercury doesn't get to pass that dam for the patient to even accidentally try to swallow it. But I always tell my patients, listen, if you cannot find a biological dentist who can safely remove your mercury fillings, you are better off to keep that mercury fillings in your mouth. Because I cannot repeat myself enough when I say that you get exposed to massive amount of mercury when the dentist starts drilling on it if you're not protected. So either do it the right way or don't touch it at all. That would be my advice to my patients. Once patients have removed their mercury fillings, hopefully safely, and if they haven't done so, they removed just conventionally in the past because they didn't have the knowledge, what should be the next step? Because as we know, when the mercury gets released, we swallow the mercury vapor or we inhale the mercury vapor. So when the mercury gets access to our body, it doesn't just stay in our blood. It gets stored in our main organs, blood, kidney, brain, liver. So it's very important for that individual to get tested by some alternative medicine doctor. In my practice, I have a luxury of working with great alternative medicine doctors, so we always team up. It's great to have a team and get tested for heavy metals now in their system, because as a biological dentist, we eliminate it from their mouth, but how about all the exposures that individual had throughout the years? What happens to that mercury in their bodies?
There's several tests that I use in my clinic to assess a patient's levels of toxicity in their body. When it comes to heavy metals, I use a company called Doctor's Data. Doctor's Data is really the gold standard to understand this load of toxicity when it comes to metals in the body. It's done through a urine test. So when you do a urine test, you have to do what is called a pre and a post challenge. A pre-challenge shows you what's currently in the body, so the current exposure, and a post-challenge shows you what's stored in the tissue, in the cells. So you literally have to take something called DMSA, which is a chelating agent, or some patients do it through an IV form, so an agent to pull the metals. And this metal agent acts like a magnet. It pulls the metals out of the body and it shows up in the urine. So we're able to compare what's current exposure versus a life of storage in the patient. And I find that that's the most effective way to assess metals, so we know what is a current environmental trigger versus a past trigger. When it comes to other levels of assessments, I also do I do a test from a company called Genova, and it's called a toxic core panel. And the toxic core panel measures about 70 chemicals in the environment, from solvents, benzenes, anything that have gases in the environment that will cause disease, as well as chlorine and PCBs, phthalates, parabens, plastics, or what we call BPA, pesticides, organophosphates. So it really is checking at all areas, in all areas of the body, of what could be the cause of disease for the patient. So I like to do both tests, but doctor's data is the one that I prefer to use for heavy metal. Once I get a test report back, what I do is, of course, communicate with the patient, let them know of the results, but I really try to understand what the history is. If the results show up high on the pre-test, my job is to become a detective, to understand how those metals got in their body. If the levels are currently high, we want to know where are they getting it from? What's the sourcing of them? So I would ask all the areas that I know potentially each metal is associated with, so we can minimize exposure. Because when someone has heavy metals, the most important thing to do is to minimize the exposure. And then we can move on to discuss treatment options. So treatment options, when you want to start someone on a chelation protocol, which chelation is the process of removing metals from the body by using a chelating agent, a binder. And there's many binders called calcium EDTA, DMPS, DMSA. There's IV forms, there's oral forms. I use all forms depending on the case of the patient. So we do it very uniquely, very individualized. It's not one standard fits all. And I want to understand the health of the patient. But before we even start chelation, I guide patients into getting healthier. If their kidneys, if their liver are not detoxifying properly, it's going to be very hard to chelate someone. If their gut health is not strong and healthy, it's going to be also very difficult, because the metals, as you pull them out of your body, they've been staying and storing in the tissues, in the cells. So to prepare someone for a detox, for a cleanse, especially with heavy metals, I will always recommend patients to do sauna. Sauna is one of my favorite tools to use for detoxification, because sauna, when you measure, actually they have measured in sweat, the level of toxins is 2 to 10 times higher than in blood and urine. So it shows you that when someone is in a sauna, you're sweating profusely, you're literally moving the toxins out into the surface for the sweat to take out. So sauna is a very important piece of detoxification, and I have patients do 2 to 3 times a week. The goal is to stay there at least 30 minutes. The temperature can range between 110 to 135. It all depends on their health, on their age, and if you're going to make an investment on your health, I always tell my patients the best investment is probably to get an infrared sauna at home. I personally have one, so I try to go in 2 to 3 times a week, because there's not just exposure of metals, but the sauna is so great to undo and pull all toxins from the body. Benzenes and chlorines are being moved out of the body through sauna. So I would say that's one of my favorites. I also support patients in their pathways, in their liver pathways. So let's talk about the liver. The liver is the most important powerhouse of detox in your body. If your liver is not strong, it's going to be very hard to detoxify from anything, specifically metals. So I like to do genetic testing of my patients. It's something that I do with all my patients before we start any type of detox, as well as get an assessment of their nutritional status. I would also use, again, doctor's data. I will run their essential elements panel to look at all their mineral status, to know what is that they're lacking in their body before we start the detox process. I would also check through Genova. I do a genetic assessment panel to look at their detox pathway, particularly glutathione. Glutathione is the most important pathway I have found in my clinical practice that is really the most crucial pathway to detoxify the body. And if patients don't have a good genetics that allow them to use their own glutathione and produce their own glutathione, they're going to have a lot more challenges. They're going to get sick more easily, and they're not going to detox as well. So first we establish what is unique to that patient, where they are on their genes and their nutrition, what's their organ function looking like, and then I support their levels. So I work at really upregulating glutathione pathways through supplementation. I prefer to do a lipospheric, liposomal kind of glutathione that's best absorbed. And in my clinic, I would also use IV therapy. So we do intravenous infusions of glutathione. We also recommend patients that they support through diet. So diet is very important because if the diet is not established, it's also very hard to detox. So doing an anti-inflammatory diet, a diet that includes high fruits and vegetables, that really supports the alkalinity of the body, it's really important. So we will walk through getting the diet right, then we'll work through getting the glutathione pathways right, and it might mean taking NAC or alpha-lipoic acid. I also like to support the methylation pathway because that's the other area where detoxification takes place, so supporting their B vitamins to detox. And then we go into the gut. So before we pull those metals out, we want to make sure that the gut integrity is strong, that patients don't have a leaky gut, that patients don't have infections. So I will run a stool panel often to make sure that they have proper gut function. And if they don't have proper gut function, that's where I start, is getting the gut strong, because as you pull these metals out, they're going to irritate naturally the gut. So we want to make sure that the gut is strong, and we use binders. So I love using binders like charcoal, chlorella, bentonite clay. There's something called IMD, intestinal metal detox. A combination of those four are essential to bind, because when you pull the metals out of the body, if they're not bound and excreted properly, patients have the risk of recirculating them and getting sick from them. So it's really getting the liver and also the kidneys right. The kidneys filter a lot of the metals, so we do a lot of supportive foods or herbs like dandelion root or burdock root, and certain foods like beets or cranberries to support the kidneys. So it's getting the whole body. And lastly, we end with colonics. So colonics is another amazing way to cleanse the colon from toxins.
Are you enjoying this docuseries? My team and I are on a mission to heal the epidemic of broken brains across the world. We truly believe in the power of the information in this docuseries. You can share this information with your community by clicking the link below. Now, by learning to support my system and how to detoxify, I was able to heal and get better. Now, when I got sick again a few years ago from the mold, I had to optimize my detoxification system again. In addition to the toxins we've been talking about in this episode, I want to talk about a source of toxicity that is quickly becoming one of the most alarming things we're exposed to on a day-to-day basis. I'm talking about EMFs. EMFs, or electromagnetic frequencies, are invisible forms of energy and radiation that we are exposed to every day, all day, and all night, usually.
We start finding out, I start seeing that every single chronic patient has something in common. And that was that they have problems sleeping. There was a toxin out there. It was destroying the restoration pathways during sleep. That is why we see so many sleeping problems in old chronic patients, different type of chronic patients. One thing that we start discovering, and this is probably like 12 years ago, 13 years ago, is that there was a toxin that attacks the electric systems of the human body. We have 3 different electric systems. There are the main systems that keep us alive, is the brain, central nervous system, the heart, cardiovascular system, and immunological system. Immunological because that system works with voltage-gated channels. Well, it turns out that this mysterious toxin that we didn't understand and we didn't know exactly where it started attacking these voltage-gated channels. We have different of those channels in the human body, all over each cell. But those channels have a particular receptor, voltage receptor. And we see that the destruction of those receptors, it was one of the characteristics of all these patients. So that's how I started this journey trying to discover an electric toxin that actually led us over here. Every electric system has another component. This component I wanted to mention it as a side effect. And this one is an electric and magnetic field. Electric and magnetic field is invisible to our naked eyes.
But it doesn't mean, just because we don't see it, it doesn't mean that it's not there. So an electric system always is going to have attached this electric field. So EMFs is all the fields that can come out from any electric systems. We're electric beings, and we have zero tolerance to electric impulses from foreign electric impulses. Something that is not produced by us, because my brain right now, everybody's brain is working because it's giving these impulses, man-made electric impulses or electric fields have an interference with our own electric systems. As an example, the brain, the heart, we have biorhythm neurons that produces these neuroelectric impulses. That is how neurons communicate with themselves. In the heart, we have a natural pacemaker, and that is the one is regulating how fast or how strong we're going to have a heartbeat. One problem that we see is that the damage doesn't happen right away. And I say it like it's a problem because when you have a problem that happens right away when you get exposed to something, it's easy to connect the dots and to know, hey, that is actually going to hurt me. Talking about electromagnetic fields, it takes a long time, sometimes 10 years, 20 years. Probably seems like a long time, but let me say it, I'm 47 years old and I've been living with electricity my whole entire life. So that means that I've been exposed to electric fields for 47 years. So when I talk about 20 years causing damage, the reality is not that long. Is not that much time that it can devastate some organs. Another way that electromagnetic fields can cause harm to the human body is by breaking DNA. We know now several publications. I'm going to throw a name in there that is not very usual. Electron volts. Electron volts is the energy that these fields have. We know that more than 30 electron volts can break DNA, double strands of DNA in the human body. We have so many toxins now in the environment. We can get overwhelmed with all these different toxins that we have. And of course, we cannot get protected from all of them. One thing that we did as a group of scientists is we started to classify which toxins are one of the most important. Importance in what aspect? Well, if they break DNA or not. In 2011, finally, all the publications that all the groups, scientist groups around the world push so hard, make the World Health Organization to classify, to publish that electromagnetic radiation is a 2B carcinogen. What is a 2B carcinogen? Well, I'm going to explain in a different way. Being a toxin, being a 2B carcinogen, means that it's danger in a way that we should prevent our exposure. The precautionary principle. Precautionary principle means that if you have one scientist in one hand saying that this could be dangerous, but on the other hand, you have another scientist saying that, oh, there's no proof that it's dangerous, you should apply the precautionary principle. You should actually try to get exposed the lowest amount that you can. Because what would happen if in 15 years we proved that this scientist was wrong and you already got exposed 15 years to something that now we understand that it can devastate the human body? Being classified as a 2B carcinogen means that we have to treat it as a 2B carcinogen. It means that we have to use the precautionary principle at least when we go to sleep. No exposure, or the lowest amount of exposure at least when we go to sleep. it turns out that we go to sleep because we need to repair, we need to restore broken pieces inside of the cell.
I had night terrors. I would wake up screaming, wake up the whole house screaming on a regular basis. That was just